Hey guys, this is the next installment in my new series where I discuss the series of books written by Jonathan Kellerman that involve the characters Alex Delaware, Milo Sturgis, and any other books that exist within that universe. I believe this is the first book that exists within that universe that doesn't feature those characters, and in fact, we don't even know that it exists in universe until a later book where the characters from this book visit Alex and Milo, and we'll get to that when we get to that book. This book is called The Butcher's Theater. Again, these discussions are not for people who haven't read these books, because we talk about things that you have to read the book to know. But we'll just give you a brief synopsis just in case you're happening upon this and you haven't. So this book takes place in Jerusalem. In 1985, I believe, is referenced in the book, or I know 1975 is referenced, and then they say 10 years ago. So I believe it takes place in 1985, and it takes place, of course, Jerusalem, as I think most people know, is currently part of the nation of Israel. Over the past 100 years, it has been not, it has been partially, and those conflicts do play out in the books. The main character is a detective there named Daniel Sharavi. I have to be careful I'm saying his name right because I've been calling him Shavari for decades, however long it's been since I first read this book, and this is definitely a book that I read earlier on in my discovery of Kellerman. So I may still call him Shavari sometimes and just, excuse that. I have a little mild dyslexia. He's a detective, and he's assigned to a killing that we later learn is a serial. I think it's pretty clear from the way the book is laid out. We always know there won't be just one killing, so I don't think that's necessarily a spoiler. And they're essentially trying to catch someone in Israel that is specifically targeting young, pretty Arab women, and it appears is possibly trying to create some sort of race war between the Jews and Arabs, which, again, if you know that whole conflict area, that's not exactly an original idea. But what I love about this book is from early on, it explores things from the killer's perspective as well, kind of the way like Criminal Minds or one of those other shows does, that goes into the killer's head. And it shows him, at first it shows him as an adult, and it doesn't really talk about who he is. In fact, the first time I read the book, I wasn't really clear, but he's referenced as the Grinning Man. And then it goes back to his very early childhood, to his very earliest childhood memories, and it talks about his childhood and his development. And it shows, essentially, the things that happened that turned him into a killer. And, I mean, you could argue some people are born that way, and if you look at his parents, you can certainly make a case for that as well. But I really think it's a great case for psychologically building a messed up person who finds murder morally justified based on his upbringing. And the way that again, that's my favorite parts of the book, are the parts that show him developing as a child and his interactions with his parents and those around him. And it's fascinating, and given Kellerman's background as a child psychologist, it's probably very accurate. It certainly has the ring of truth. So that's my favorite part of the book, and that happens simultaneously along with seeing things from Shavari's point of view. Sharavi, see, I told you I was going to do it. As they discover and detect and try to find the killer in Jerusalem, and also occasionally it shows things from the other detectives' perspective and from the perspectives of a few other people involved in the case. And it's most of the other books are told from primarily the main character's perspective. Most of the Alex Delaware books are told from Alex's perspective. There's a series about Petra Conner that crosses over with Alex, and those are told from her perspective. Moses, etc. Murderer's Daughter, told from the perspective of Sharon Ransom. Is that her? No, Sharon Ransom is Silent Partner. I can't remember her name, but in any case, There's a few books where occasionally it'll switch from Alex's perspective to Milo's, but most of the time they're pretty solidly from one perspective, and in this case it flops around a lot. And it can make it hard to follow, but it also makes it really fascinating. So, and in the end, we discover, Sharavi discovers who the killer is. It doesn't necessarily matter from the reader's perspective, because from the reader's perspective, we already knew everything about him except for the name that he was going by. That's pretty much the only thing we didn't know. We knew who he was, just not who he was in Jerusalem. So it's not really a reveal in terms of finding out who the killer is, because again, we've been following him the whole way. It's a reveal for Sharavi and his team. So really, it just follows the two paths simultaneously until they, come together, and he's apprehended, or however you want to look at that. Again, we're not going to give away too much. So let's look at my notes from the book. And I think I've already addressed a lot of this just in kind of giving my synopsis in the book, but let's take a look at these notes. So, I say that this is one of my very favorite Kellerman books, largely because of the different format. I believe it is the only Kellerman book that takes place inside the mind of a serial killer. Not only that, he shows us how a serial killer is created. My favorite parts of the book are showing the killers, who is initially referred to as the Grinning Man, showing his childhood. Like I said, that's absolutely one of my favorite parts of this book. Those are my favorite passages. Even though Kellerman makes it obvious, the first time I read this book, I completely missed the introduction of the Grinning Man. I thought we first heard of him as a small child, when he was referred to by that name, the Grinning Man, later, I was confused. Because, like I said earlier, what happens is they introduce him as an adult, as the Grinning Man. They kind of show him a bit as a killer, and then they go back and they start from childhood and go forward. And initially, I don't think I realized it was the same person, but that was my mistake, not paying close enough attention as a reader. The book has a lot of moving parts, and it takes a while for a lot of them to come together, and some of them never come together. So that's one of my favorite parts of this book, is showing things from the killer's perspective. My other favorite part of the book is Sharavi. I love Daniel Sharavi. I think he's a great character. He might even be my favorite character in the Delaware universe, even more so than Milo and Alex. I'm very glad they brought him back in a future book, and I was really wanting to see him again after that, and I hope... it's been 20, 30 years since the last book that he was featured in, but he could still be out there. So I sincerely hope that Kellerman will bring him back in a future book. Despite the fact that this is one of my favorite Kellerman books, I don't read it every time I go through the series. I think we've definitely talked about in these videos that I read these books start to finish, the whole series, skipping one, from the first book to the end, and then I start over again. It's just my kind of downtime, peace, cleansing, relaxation, anti-anxiety, in line at the bank. It's just a thing. Like, people rewatch shows. My wife and I do that too. Rewatch The Office. I reread these books. And there are some books that I skip every time. There are some books that I skip sometimes. This one I skip sometimes, even though it's one of my favorites, because it's not the most relaxing read. It is a stressful book to read. It's much longer than the average Kellerman book. The tone is very dark. There's not really the light banter that there normally is between Alex and Milo. And since it takes place in Jerusalem, there's a lot of culture shock. And speaking of culture shock, one other thing that keeps hitting me when I read the book is how rude everyone seems to be. Like, literally, you read through the book and it just seems like, why is he being so rude? And then, if you're like me, immediately after you have that reaction, you realize that that's the American, because if you have been outside of America and come back, you'll realize that here in this country, we put a lot of airs on. We pretend to be nicer than we are. We add a lot of platitudes, and we pretend a lot. We're very fake over here. And in Europe and the Middle East, they're often not like that. They don't often pretend. They tell you exactly what they're thinking and feeling. And even areas of the U.S. that we think are direct like that, I use the examples of New York and Philly, Boston, are still much more American in that sense. And over there, people they're kind of honest with themselves about their feelings, and they're kind of honest with other people about them. Okay, so I talked in a previous video about Kellerman's pro-Israel bias. And I don't think it would surprise anyone that this is a book set in Israel with Jewish characters, so this book very obviously would have a pro-Israel bias. I don't think that's a shock to anyone. I think anyone reading it would expect that. But what surprised me when I reread it this time was it seemed to have very much an anti-Arab and anti-Muslim bias, more so than just pro-Israel, anti-Palestine, but in terms of really portraying Islam as a very primitive religion, portraying Arabs as primitive. There are examples throughout the book showing Judaism as very primitive and very progressive. There's just there's Jewish radicals, Jewish progressives, and everybody in between. But with the Arabs and the Muslims, which in the book are largely one and the same, it pretty much shows them all as radical and fundamentalist. And there's one main character who's an Arab, but he's a Christian. And I don't think I realized until reading it through this time around that that's really kind of a Western washing, like the good Arab is a Christian. He's not one of those Muslims. It's very, very biased in a not so subtle way. I don't think there's a single Arab character who is Muslim in the book that's really respected. And so that's definitely, even like I said, this is one of my favorite books, but it definitely has some flaws. At the beginning of the book, Kellerman summarizes the Israel-Palestine conflict for the reader. And it leaves out some key details, particularly how Israel came to be a state and where the Jews that essentially founded the modern state of Israel came from. It just kind of pretends that they were always there and always wanted it to be a state and so on and so forth. And kind of glosses over the whole Holocaust thing too, ironically. So it leaves out some details that make the case stronger for Palestine, but that notwithstanding, it's a very good summary of what has transpired in terms of the history and creation of modern-day Israel. It's such a tough topic, and so many people don't understand it, and trying to explain it to someone is incredibly difficult. I've tried to explain it to people, and it's very difficult to explain, and Kellerman does a remarkable job. It's a very, very concise, easy-to-understand explanation, despite leaving out a few key points. And then later in the book, Dowd, who is the Christian Arab detective, gives his point of view of the current conflict, current as of 1985 when the book is set, and it's a very, very eloquent summary of Jew-Muslim relations in the area. A few of the points that stood out to me as portraying Muslims as backwards and fundamentalist were when Sharavi, early in the book, meets a single male Muslim. He says, he thinks to himself, why didn't he purchase a wife? As though all Muslims purchase their wives. As though that's which, again, in the more fundamentalist cultures, that is a thing. But it's also a thing in fundamentalist Christianity and Judaism as well. And so on and so forth. There's another comment where it's the author, it's Kellerman, I think he's being Sharavi's thoughts, says the Muslims have no use for a woman who doesn't bear children. And then later in the book, he says, to the Arabs, a woman talking might as well have been a donkey braying. It's, basically saying all Muslims don't respect women, all Arabs don't respect women. And while it's certainly true that there's a lot of fundamentalist Islamic culture that does not respect women, I feel like it's painting with a very broad brush. And even within Israel and Palestine, not all Muslims are fundamentalist. So, okay, moving forward. Let's see, where's the next point? There's a scene later in the book where Daniel is confronting a Muslim detective named Habiba. Not detective, I think he's just a patrolman. And he's very, very rude to him, and it implies that he just was terrible at his job. But it doesn't appear that the old patrolman did anything wrong. Like, there was nothing he really could have done differently, and I think Daniel is just completely rude to him for no reason. They reference the mayor of Jerusalem, now it's I don't believe there's a mayor anymore. Now it's a prime minister, and they talk about him, and he's a character in the book. And I wonder if the mayor in the book is based on any real historical figures. At the time, the mayor of Jerusalem would have been Teddy Kollek. I'm probably saying his last name wrong. There's a character in the book named Roselli. He's a very minor character, and I think the detectives, or at least some of them, wonder if there's a possibility that he's the killer. But I think it's very clear to the reader that he's not ever. Like, I don't think the reader is ever supposed to think that he is. But the detectives have some concerns about him, and they wonder about him, and he's under surveillance. And Dowd overhears a conversation between Roselli and a rabbi that just wraps up all the loose ends nicely, and it just seems way too convenient and too cute. And again, this is not a plot point, so I don't think this is a spoiler, but in giving it some context, Roselli is a monk who converted to being a monk from being a social worker in the U.S. He was a social worker in the U.S. who then came to be a monk in a convent in Israel, and then who's now converting to Judaism. And it doesn't really make sense. Like, he's portrayed and even described as one of those people that's just kind of wandering, looking for purpose, looking for his belief system, and that very much seems like the case. But the questions he asks the rabbi and the conversation he has with the rabbi don't really make sense to me as somebody who has been active and involved in a lot of different religions and studied a lot of different religions and a lot of different people in different religions. Because it's just basically, he's like, I came to Israel and I now realize that the Jews are the real faith, or whatever it is that he says. The core of it is Jewish, I think, is the line that he says. And so if anybody who's studied religion, you know that the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran are all based on a lot of the same texts. And in fact, pretty much most of the Old Testament and then most of the Torah are the same. Obviously, the New Testament is unique to Christianity because that's, the story of Jesus Christ and everything that came after him. And then the Quran pulls from Jewish and Christian texts. And so there's a lot of similarities. And the biggest difference between Judaism and Christianity, and in this case Roman Catholicism, is Jesus Christ. And the rabbi basically asks him if he's willing to denounce his family. And he says that he is. But, wouldn't the most important thing for him to be to denounce Jesus Christ? Because that's really the most significant difference between those two faiths. And that never comes up. So it seems like a weird interaction, and I feel like if Roselli was a real character, I'd have some pretty serious questions for him. And given that he's not, it makes me question that character just doesn't really seem genuine to me. Okay, moving on. They reference many times in the book a rabbi named the Prostanitzer, but that's his title, like the Prostanitzer. And I'm like, well, what's a Prostanitzer? Like, it's not a Prostanitzer. It's not his last name. It's the Prostanitzer, and I don't know what that is. Okay, there's a reference to the book in night music. He's Sharavi is interviewing, and I'm probably saying this wrong, a Bedouin, which is a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? A primitive Arab culture that does not... They're kind of like the Amish, but Arab. Or Muslim, rather. And they seem to be very wholesome, but they disavow modern technology and everything like that. And he's interviewing him about being out at night and what he witnessed. And the Bedouin man references the sounds of bugs and the sounds of animals in the grass and just the faint stuff that you hear if you're out at night away from anything city and anything urban. And Sharavi references that as night music. It's the same stuff he heard when he was in military duty in the middle of nowhere. And I love the term. Anybody who's ever been outside away from like cars and planes and things of that nature where what you hear is nature, I love calling it night music. So I've been using that term a lot. I don't know if it originated in this book, but it certainly, for me, that's where it did. So, when Julian is the young boy, first describes the ice palace, he references marble floors. then later on in the book, he's pulling up the carpets and sitting on bare plywood floors. So is that a continuity error? Was there never marble floors? And then last thing is there's a criminal in the book referenced as the Gray Man, and the ending of the book implies that he might have been caught, but it never answers that, and I don't know if any future books do. So I'm curious to know, was the Gray Man ever caught? So again, these are the things I would discuss with Kellerman or anybody else who is as passionate about these books as I am. And if you are as passionate about these books as I am, then feel free to comment on the video and let's have the discussion. And I will see you. The next book is Silent Partner, which of the books I don't normally skip is the one that confuses me the most. It's probably my least favorite Alex Delaware book, other than the one that I skip, which I think is called The Web. So we'll get to that next. I'm going to have a lot of questions because I've never understood that book fully. So if I don't talk to you beforehand, have a great holiday season. So, because we're discussing a book where the primary characters are Jewish, and it takes place in Jerusalem and Israel. So I will say Happy Hanukkah to anybody out there watching who celebrates. Merry Christmas, and all of the other great, Happy New Year's, Winter Solstice, Kwanzaa, have a great holiday season, and I will talk to you after the next book.